Tokyo, a city that believed itself untouchable. A nation certain that the Pacific belonged to them. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan celebrated a streak of victories so overwhelming that even their top commanders whispered one phrase: "The Americans have no fight left." But they were wrong. Dead wrong. On April 18, 1942, a mission so daring, so impossible, so reckless that even its own pilots believed they wouldn't return, was launched directly at the heart of the Japanese Empire. This is the story of 80 American volunteers, led by one stubborn, brilliant, and relentless man, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who strapped bombs onto land-based aircraft, loaded them onto a naval carrier, and took off knowing they could not return home. The mission didn't just drop bombs on Tokyo. It dropped fear. It shattered the myth of Japan's invincibility. And it forced the Japanese high command into decisions that would eventually cost them the entire war. This is the raid that changed everything. The Pacific in early 1942 was a vast, burning battlefield where every headline, every radio broadcast, and every whispered conversation carried the same dark message: Japan was unstoppable. The empire that had spent years quietly sharpening its sword now swung it across Asia and the Pacific with terrifying speed. In just a few months, Japan had captured Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies. Their war machine rolled forward like a tidal wave, swallowing everything in its path. And America? America was still reeling. Pearl Harbor was not just an attack, it was a humiliation. Battleships lay twisted and broken in the harbor, smoke still rising over the water long after the flames died. Families across the United States received telegrams confirming the deaths of sons, brothers, and husbands. The mighty American Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning, and Japanese newspapers gloated that the United States had been knocked out in one punch. Tokyo believed it. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed it. Even some American leaders feared it. Japan's confidence soared to the point where its top admirals openly mocked the United States, claiming Americans were soft, emotionally weak, and too divided to wage a long, brutal war. Tokyo's war planners expected the U.S. to negotiate rather than retaliate. They expected hesitation, fear, confusion, anything but courage. Every victory fed Japan's arrogance. Their Zero fighters dominated the skies. Their naval forces seemed invincible. Their armies marched across Asia with mechanical precision, enforcing obedience with fire and steel. And while Japan expanded, America scrambled. Factories rushed to switch from civilian production to wartime manufacturing. Young men lined up at recruitment offices. But morale was still fragile. People were angry, hurt, and desperate for proof that America could strike back. Newspapers demanded answers. Citizens wanted revenge. Military leaders wanted an opportunity. But that opportunity seemed impossible. Japan was too far. American bombers could not reach Tokyo. No airfield existed close enough to launch an attack. Aircraft carriers were the only vessels capable of approaching Japan, but their planes did not carry bombs big enough to matter. And even if bombers could somehow reach Tokyo, they would not have enough fuel to return. The Pacific was a prison. A prison Japan believed America could never break out of. It was in this moment of despair, this moment when Japan bragged openly that no American bomb will ever fall on Tokyo, that the seeds of the most daring air raid in human history were planted. A raid that would defy physics, strategy, and logic itself. A raid that would travel 650 nautical miles beyond the safe limit. A raid designed not just to hit buildings, but to hit Japan's pride. The Pacific was in flames. America was on its knees. Japan was certain victory was near. And that is exactly why the United States needed a miracle, something bold, something reckless, something impossible. Something only one man could conceive. Japan entered 1942 with a kind of confidence that bordered on fantasy, a belief that destiny itself had crowned them rulers of Asia and guardians of the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese newspapers trumpeted headlines that declared America spiritually crushed and militarily paralyzed. Radio broadcasts spread the message that the United States did not have the stomach for a long, bloody conflict. Even Japan's education system began teaching children that the empire would control half the world within a decade. Inside Tokyo's war rooms, a dangerous illusion took hold, the belief that America was already defeated in every way that mattered. The Imperial Japanese Navy, dripping with pride, believed the Pacific belonged entirely to them. Their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, had become symbols of unstoppable dominance. Their pilots were experienced, disciplined, and battle-proven. Their Zero fighter had no equal in the early months of the war. Every map, every strategic report, every whispered conversation reinforced the same idea: Japan was unbeatable. But overconfidence blinds even the most powerful empires. Japanese military leaders viewed Americans through a lens of arrogance and racial superiority. They believed Americans were soft, pampered by comfort, lacking discipline, and terrified of hardship. Japanese officers told their men that Americans preferred luxury over sacrifice, movies over combat, and business over bravery. Because of this, Tokyo strategists believed the US would never dare mount a counterattack, not soon, and certainly not near the Japanese homeland. The empire's expansion across Asia only fueled this illusion. Singapore, once thought impregnable, fell in weeks. The American forces in the Philippines struggled desperately. The British and Dutch colonies collapsed like dry wood. Japanese soldiers marched forward with an aura of invincibility, claiming territory after territory as if collecting trophies. And each victory convinced Japan even further that fate was on their side. Tokyo believed America's industrial power was useless without the will to fight. They believed Americans were like bamboo, tall, impressive, but hollow inside. And perhaps the biggest mistake of all, Japan believed it had time. Time to fortify, time to expand, time to secure resources, time to negotiate from a position of strength. They laughed at the idea of American bombers appearing over Tokyo. Admirals said it was geographically impossible. Army leaders said the United States did not have the courage for a direct strike. Politicians claimed Japanese cities were protected by thousands of miles of ocean, an unbeatable shield. But behind the scenes, US leaders were not afraid. They were angry. And anger, when paired with desperation, breeds bold ideas. President Franklin Roosevelt needed something dramatic, something symbolic, something that would shake the American people awake and remind them that the war was far from over. He knew morale needed a spark. He knew the world needed proof that Japan was not invincible. And he knew exactly the kind of man capable of delivering such a shock. As Japan basked in its illusion of invulnerability, one American quietly sharpened a plan that would shatter that belief forever. WWII January 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was carrying the weight of a wounded nation on his shoulders. Every newspaper he picked up spoke of Japanese victories. Every intelligence report painted a bleak picture. Every radio broadcast reminded Americans of Pearl Harbor, the broken ships, the lost sailors, and the painful truth: the United States had been caught unprepared. Roosevelt knew something had to change, and fast. Morale was dangerously low. The American public was angry but directionless. The military was rebuilding but discouraged. The world doubted whether the United States could stand toe-to-toe with Japan. Allies looked to Washington with uncertainty. Enemies watched with confidence. Roosevelt needed something bold. Something shocking. Something that would echo across the Pacific. A message to Japan: you are not safe. A message to Americans: we will fight back. A message to the world: the United States is only getting started. But what could achieve all that? The U.S. Navy was still recovering from Pearl Harbor. Aircraft carriers were precious and limited. Long-range bombers were land-based and too large for carrier decks. No American airfield existed anywhere close to Tokyo. Every expert, every admiral, every planner said the same thing: "Sir, bombing Japan is impossible." But Roosevelt refused to accept the word impossible. He demanded options. He demanded creativity. He demanded a plan that defied conventional strategy. And during one intense meeting, he spoke the words that would ignite one of the greatest missions in military history: "We must bomb Japan. I don't care how." He didn't want a small symbolic hit. He wanted a psychological shockwave. He wanted the American public to wake up with hope, not fear. He wanted Japanese leaders to sleep with uncertainty, not confidence. He wanted the Axis powers to understand that America, no matter how wounded, was still a giant capable of striking back. Military commanders scrambled, brainstorming anything that could work. Airfields on newly captured islands? Impossible. Submarine-launched aircraft? Too small. A daring commando raid? Ineffective. None of the ideas had the power Roosevelt wanted. Then a question emerged in a planning room. What if Army bombers could take off from a Navy aircraft carrier? Everyone laughed at first. It was unthinkable. Army bombers were too heavy, too large, and too long for a carrier deck. They required long runways. They weren't built for sea operations. Bringing them near Japan risked the loss of carriers, something America could not afford. But Roosevelt didn't care about the risks. He cared about the effect. He demanded a mission that would inspire legends. A mission that would terrify Tokyo. A mission that would remind the world who America truly was. And when planners asked who could turn this insane idea into reality, one name repeated itself around the room. James Harold Doolittle. Pilot. Daredevil. Engineer. Innovator. A man known for doing things other pilots believed were physically impossible. Roosevelt didn't hesitate. He summoned Doolittle. Because if America needed a miracle, there was only one man who might create it. When James Harold Doolittle walked into the planning room in early 1942, he carried with him a reputation that bordered on myth. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a pioneer, a scientist, a daredevil, a man who saw the sky not as a limit, but as a challenge begging to be conquered. At a time when aviation was still young and unpredictable, Doolittle had already rewritten its rules more times than most pilots had flown cross-country. Born in California and raised with a fierce determination to prove himself, Doolittle became one of America's earliest aviation prodigies. He had flown stunts that left crowds breathless. He completed doctoral-level research at MIT that changed the future of flight. He became the first pilot to fly entirely by instruments, with no visual reference to the ground, a milestone that revolutionized aviation safety. His colleagues called him fearless. His rivals called him reckless. The truth was somewhere in between. But above all, Doolittle was the kind of leader who inspired absolute confidence. When Roosevelt's raid proposal reached the Army Air Forces, commanders knew they needed someone with skill, courage, and creativity, someone who could turn a suicidal concept into a working plan. There was only one man who fit that description. Doolittle listened carefully as military planners laid out the impossible. Army B-25 medium bombers would have to launch from the deck of a Navy aircraft carrier, fly hundreds of miles to Japan, drop bombs on Tokyo, and then attempt to reach China with barely enough fuel to stay in the air. No bomber had ever taken off from a carrier before. None were designed for it. Most experts believed the mission would end with all aircraft lost and all pilots killed or captured. Doolittle didn't flinch. To him, impossibility was just another engineering problem waiting for a solution. He didn't ask if the mission could be done. He asked how long he had to make it work. His mind was already racing through calculations: takeoff speed, fuel loads, weight reduction, weather patterns, enemy patrol zones, and the untested limits of the B-25 Mitchell. The officers watching him that day later said it was like witnessing lightning strike the room. Doolittle didn't doubt. He didn't hesitate. He simply said, "If we can find volunteers, we can do it." His confidence electrified the room. He understood the stakes. He understood the risks. But more importantly, he understood the moment. America needed hope, and he was willing to gamble his life to provide it. Within hours, Doolittle was officially placed in command of the secret operation that would soon bear his name. He accepted the assignment knowing full well what it meant. Success would shock the world. Failure would hand Japan a propaganda victory and likely end his career, or his life. When he left the meeting, he didn't go home. He didn't sleep. He didn't rest. James Doolittle went straight to work, because he knew that time was running out, and the eyes of a wounded nation were looking for a man bold enough to strike back. The idea sounded like something ripped from the pages of a wartime adventure novel. Take a land-based medium bomber, an aircraft built for long runways, solid ground, and spacious airfields, and somehow launch it from the narrow deck of a moving aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. To most military planners, the concept bordered on madness. But to James Doolittle, it was an engineering challenge that could be solved with precision, daring, and an unshakable understanding of how far American pilots were willing to go. From the beginning, the mission existed in a strange space between brilliance and insanity. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was chosen because it was compact enough to theoretically fit on a carrier deck yet powerful and durable enough to carry bombs all the way to Japan. But choosing a plane was the easy part. Making it work was another story. First, the B-25 had never taken off from anything shorter than a long, flat runway. A carrier deck gave pilots just a few hundred feet, barely enough space to lift a fighter plane, let alone a massive bomber loaded with fuel and explosives. The margin for error was essentially zero. Too slow, and the plane would dip into the ocean. Too heavy, and it wouldn't lift at all. Too early on the throttle, and the engines might stall before leaving the deck. Even Doolittle admitted privately that the takeoff alone could kill half the crew. Then there was the matter of landing. There would be no landing. Once the bombers were airborne, they would fly toward Tokyo, drop their bombs, and continue west toward China. They could not return to the carrier. They could not land in Japan. And because they would be forced to launch hundreds of miles earlier than planned, they wouldn't have enough fuel to reach safe territory. The mission was effectively one way. Every volunteer had to accept that he might be crashing into darkness over the Chinese countryside, ditching into the sea, or becoming a prisoner of the Japanese. Still, Doolittle pushed forward. He worked with engineers to modify the planes. Armor was removed to reduce weight. Extra fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bays and crawl spaces. Machine guns were replaced with lighter replicas. Some crews even installed broomsticks painted black to mimic tail guns, hoping to deter Japanese fighters. Every ounce saved mattered. Every modification brought the mission one step closer to reality. Meanwhile, planners had to coordinate a delicate dance between the Army Air Forces and the Navy, two branches that rarely trained together at this level. The USS Hornet would carry the B-25s to striking distance, while the USS Enterprise would provide fighter protection. It was a massive, complex, never-before-attempted cooperation, and any mistake could doom the entire operation. Despite all of this, Doolittle's confidence never wavered. He understood something most strategists didn't. Impossible missions become possible when you have men willing to risk everything. And he knew America had those men. The plan was reckless, dangerous, borderline impossible. But in war, the craziest ideas often change history. And this one was nothing about the Doolittle Raid resembled a normal military operation. In fact, one of the most astonishing aspects of the mission was that it required the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy to work together in a way neither branch had ever attempted before. Traditionally, Navy pilots launched from carriers while Army Air Forces pilots operated from land. Their aircraft, training, strategies, and even command cultures were completely different. Yet now, for the first time in American history, the Navy would carry Army bombers into battle. It was an insane fusion of two worlds. The USS Hornet, one of America's newest aircraft carriers, was selected for the mission. Her flight deck was long enough, barely, to give the B-25s a fighting chance at takeoff. Her crew, initially confused when they received sealed orders, soon learned they were about to embark on one of the most daring missions of the war. On March 31, 1942, the Hornet arrived at Alameda Naval Air Station in California. Civilians and sailors watched in disbelief as large Army B-25 bombers rolled toward the carrier. Most had never seen a bomber up close, much less on a Navy ship. As one Hornet sailor put it, "We thought someone had lost their mind." Loading the bombers onto the deck was a spectacle of its own. The planes were hoisted aboard by crane, each weighing nearly 15,000 pounds. Deck crews had to position them with mathematical precision, nose to tail, leaving barely a meter of space between aircraft. Unlike fighters, the B-25s had no folding wings. The deck was packed so tightly that even walking between bombers was difficult. It quickly became clear, once these planes launched, they were never coming back. The carrier had no room for them to land, no equipment to recover them, and no plan to save them. This would be a one-way ticket for both the aircraft and the men. Training began immediately. Army pilots practiced short takeoffs at Eglin Field in Florida, using a runway marked to mimic the length of a carrier deck. Doolittle watched closely as pilots learned to throttle up while holding the brakes, release at the perfect moment, and lift off at dangerously slow speeds. Every second counted. Every hesitation meant failure. But training on land could only prepare them so much. Taking off from a carrier deck in the middle of the ocean, while the ship pitched and rolled in heavy seas, was an entirely different reality. Meanwhile, the Navy prepared the Hornet. Anti-aircraft crews drilled tirelessly. Fuel stores were adjusted to carry the bomber's needs. Fighter wings from the USS Enterprise would accompany the Hornet as an umbrella of protection. Radio silence was enforced. Tankers and escorts formed a protective screen around the two carriers. Every man aboard knew, if the task force were discovered, the Japanese fleet would immediately strike. Amid the tension, a powerful sense of pride grew among the crew. They were about to participate in something unprecedented, something that could change the course of the war. Seeing Army bombers sitting on the deck of a Navy carrier was a sight so shocking, so unusual, that sailors joked, "If this doesn't scare the Japanese, nothing will." Little did they know, the Japanese would be more than scared. They would be stunned. The heart of the Doolittle Raid wasn't the aircraft, the carriers, or the careful planning. It was the 80 men who willingly stepped forward, knowing they might not return. These were not soldiers ordered into combat, they were volunteers. Men who raised their hands when told the mission was extremely dangerous, highly secret, and likely impossible. They volunteered before knowing the target, the distance, or even whether there would be any way home. They didn't ask, "Will we survive?" They asked, "When do we start?" James Doolittle wanted only the best: experienced pilots, tough navigators, calm bombardiers, and dependable engineers. He went to the 17th Bomb Group, a unit already known for discipline and skill. The moment the opportunity was announced, nearly every man stepped forward. They didn't need persuasion. After Pearl Harbor, they wanted revenge. They wanted to strike back. They wanted the world to know that America would not stay silent. The selection process was rigorous. Doolittle chose men who could think fast, adapt under pressure, and maintain composure even when facing death. Many were barely in their 20s, farm boys, mechanics, clerks, students, but they were fueled by courage, patriotism, and a fierce determination to prove themselves. Some had never seen combat before. None had ever attempted a mission remotely like this. The training began in secrecy. The volunteers practiced takeoffs from runways marked to simulate the Hornet's flight deck. They trained at dawn and dusk, pushing themselves to lift heavy bombers into the air in less than 500 feet. They practiced flying at extremely low altitudes, sometimes just a few meters above the water, to evade radar. They memorized maps of Japan without knowing the exact target. They rehearsed emergency ditching procedures, survival techniques, and how to escape if captured. Still, Doolittle refused to tell them everything. The destination, the distance, the risk, much of it remained classified until the last possible moment. And yet the men trusted him completely. His confidence became their confidence. His determination became their fuel. During downtime, the atmosphere among the crews mixed camaraderie with tension. Some wrote letters home, describing a normal training routine, hiding the truth behind carefully chosen words. Others joked around to mask their nerves. A few quietly prepared themselves for the possibility that they might never return. For many of the men, this was their first time aboard a carrier. When the USS Hornet pushed away from the dock, cheers erupted along the shore. Crowds waved flags, believing the ship was headed for a standard mission. Only the men aboard knew the truth. They were carrying America's hope, America's anger, and America's message to Japan. Once at sea, Doolittle finally told the crews their true objective. Tokyo. A stunned silence fell across the room. Then, almost immediately, smiles spread. Some laughed in disbelief. Some sat quietly, absorbing the magnitude of what lay ahead. But not one man backed out. In that moment, 80 volunteers became 80 warriors. They weren't just flying planes, they were carrying the weight of a nation. And every single one of them was ready. Because to them, courage mattered more than fear. And history remembers courage. Training for the Doolittle Raid was unlike anything the U.S. Army Air Forces had ever attempted. These men weren't preparing for a standard bombing run. They were preparing for a mission that demanded precision, discipline, and nerves of steel. Every part of their training had to rewire the way they flew, the way they thought, and the way they reacted under pressure. The first challenge was short-field takeoff. The B-25 bomber normally required more than 3,000 feet of runway to safely get airborne. The Hornet's deck offered less than 500. That meant pilots had to master an extremely risky technique, full throttle, maximum power, and lift off at dangerously low speeds. During practice, instructors marked a 500-foot section of runway with white paint. Day after day, crews tested themselves, accelerating down the short strip, feeling the aircraft strain as it climbed into the air. Every takeoff was a reminder of reality. If they failed once, just once, they would die at sea. Next came low-altitude flying. To evade Japanese radar, the bombers had to fly at treetop level, sometimes just 20 to 30 feet above the water. At such low altitudes, even a slight mistake could send the aircraft slamming into the ocean. Pilots trained to keep their planes stable despite wind gusts, turbulence, and constant waves beneath them. Flying low also demanded intense concentration. Crews had to conserve fuel, navigate blind spots, and maintain formation without climbing high enough to be intercepted. Navigators trained relentlessly. Getting lost over the Pacific meant certain death. The raiders practiced using outdated maps of Japan, studying rivers, coastlines, and landmarks they might see seconds before releasing bombs. They memorized routes from intuition and instinct, not GPS or advanced instruments. Bombardiers practiced speed. They would have only seconds to locate their targets over Tokyo before anti-aircraft guns began firing. Precision mattered. Hesitation meant doom. The crews also trained for emergency ditching, crashing into the sea. They learned how to inflate life rafts, how to escape a sinking aircraft, how to rescue wounded crew, and how long they could survive in cold Pacific waters. They practiced bailing out over rough terrain, even though they knew parachuting into Japanese-occupied China was almost as dangerous as the raid itself. Then came survival and capture training. Japanese treatment of prisoners was notoriously brutal. The men learned how to navigate through forests, avoid patrols, and seek help from Chinese resistance fighters. They memorized code phrases and emergency signals, but they also understood a horrifying truth. If captured, their chances of survival were slim. Despite the risks, the morale remained incredibly high. Crews formed strong bonds. They ate together, trained together, laughed together, and quietly acknowledged that this mission could be the last thing they ever did. What kept them going was the purpose. The fire of Pearl Harbor still burned in their hearts. Each man carried his own reason for volunteering: family, duty, honor, and revenge. Doolittle himself trained alongside the men, leading from the front. He performed the same short takeoffs, practiced the same low-altitude maneuvers, and pushed himself as hard as anyone. The men admired him, trusted him, and followed him. Because they knew he wasn't asking them to take any risk he wasn't willing to take himself. By the end of their training, the volunteers had become a unified force, skilled, fearless, and ready for the impossible. And soon, the impossible would come for them. When the news of the Doolittle Raid reached Tokyo, it did not simply irritate Japanese leaders, it shattered their illusion of invulnerability. Inside the war cabinet, a quiet panic began to spread, though none of the officials dared show it openly. Japan had promised its people that the imperial military would keep the homeland completely protected. For months, propaganda repeated the same message: Japan is untouchable. Japan is invincible. Japan's enemies are too weak, too slow, too afraid to strike back. But the sight of American bombers over Tokyo, no matter how few, destroyed that myth in seconds. The Japanese leaders gathered urgently, realizing something terrifying: if America could hit Tokyo once, they could do it again, stronger, larger, and deadlier. And next time, it wouldn't be a symbolic raid. Next time, it could be an invasion signal. Prime Minister Tojo, known for his iron resolve, was shaken. He demanded answers. How did enemy aircraft reach our capital? How did our Navy, our pride, fail to detect a single carrier? The questions hung in the air, and everyone in the room knew the painful truth: Japan's defensive perimeter was far weaker than they claimed. The Pacific was massive, and the United States had the naval industry to fill it with ships, hundreds of them. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, understood the danger most clearly. He had warned Japanese leadership before the war that America's industrial power could crush Japan if the war dragged on. Now he had proof staring him in the face. The Doolittle Raid, although small in destructive power, revealed a long-term nightmare. America was ramping up, and Japan had no way to stop that avalanche. Inside the meeting room, Japanese commanders argued fiercely about what the raid meant. Some believed America was desperate, using risky long-range tactics simply to boost their morale. Others saw it differently: this wasn't desperation, this was a warning. But Yamamoto saw the future with chilling clarity. The raid told him something crucial. America was not backing down. America was not intimidated. America was preparing for total war. Japan had started the fight at Pearl Harbor, thinking the US would negotiate or surrender. But the raid on Tokyo revealed a truth that froze every man in the room: America had only begun to fight. This realization forced Japan's hand. Pride and fear combined into a strategic obsession. They needed to destroy the US carriers before the Americans grew too powerful. This panic-driven decision would lead directly to the Battle of Midway, where Japan would gamble everything and lose everything. For now, however, the atmosphere inside Tokyo's leadership was heavy with dread. They had awakened a giant, and now they were discovering something even worse than Yamamoto's famous prediction. The giant was angry, and he was preparing to strike back with forces Japan could not imagine. The meticulous secrecy of the Doolittle Raid was shattered long before the first B-25 lifted off from the USS Hornet. On April 17, 1942, just as the task force approached the launch point, a Japanese patrol boat, an unassuming vessel that no one aboard the Hornet had anticipated, spotted the carrier group. The seemingly routine sighting sent ripples of panic and urgency through the American fleet. The Navy's carefully calculated timing had been thrown into chaos, and now Doolittle faced a choice that would determine the success or failure of the entire mission. The patrol boat was small and fast, slicing through the calm Pacific waters. On board the Hornet, lookouts strained to see the faint outline on the horizon. Every man knew that being spotted meant immediate danger. The Japanese would radio the location of the carriers to their main fleet, potentially allowing a powerful force to intercept the bombers before they ever reached Japan. The task force, already operating at the extreme edge of its operational range, could not afford a confrontation with the Japanese Navy. Doolittle convened his officers quickly. There was no room for hesitation. The original plan called for the bombers to launch at a point 400 miles from Japan, a distance calculated to ensure fuel would last for the strike and the subsequent flight toward China. Being discovered meant the fleet was too close to the enemy, and any delay or miscalculation could leave the planes stranded over the open ocean with no hope of reaching safety. Every second mattered. The decision was agonizing. Launch too early, and the bombers would risk running out of fuel before reaching friendly territory. Launch too late, and the Japanese patrol could alert reinforcements, turning the mission into a massacre. Doolittle weighed the risks, scanning the horizon and imagining the consequences. The crew, sensing the tension, trusted their commander implicitly. They had trained for the impossible, now they were living it. Finally, Doolittle gave the order, launch immediately. The carriers began maneuvering to provide as long a deck as possible, engines roaring as sailors cleared the flight deck with precision. The B-25s, already tense and loaded with bombs and extra fuel, were pushed to the limit. Pilots climbed into the cockpits, adjusted throttles, and waited for Doolittle's signal. The deck was a sliver of metal surrounded by thousands of miles of unforgiving ocean, but there was no alternative. As the first plane roared down the flight deck, sailors held their breath. The patrol boat faded into the distance, unaware of the drama unfolding just beyond its line of sight. One by one, the B-25s lifted into the sky, engines screaming, wings catching the sunlight, carrying America's daring message directly toward Tokyo. Each takeoff was a miracle, a testament to the training, precision, and courage of the crews. The sighting of the patrol boat, while terrifying, had accelerated the raid. It forced Doolittle and his men into immediate action, leaving no room for second-guessing. The Japanese had inadvertently catalyzed the first successful strike on their homeland. From that moment, the raid became a race against fuel, distance, and fate itself. Every mile toward Japan now carried the weight of history and the destiny of a nation eager to fight back. The moment of truth arrived on April 18, 1942. The USS Hornet's deck buzzed with nervous energy as the Doolittle Raiders prepared for the mission of a lifetime. Every sailor, officer, and pilot knew that this was no ordinary operation. Every takeoff could mean life or death. And now, because of the unexpected sighting of a Japanese patrol boat, the order came earlier than planned. Doolittle had to make a decision that would forever define the mission. The original plan had been to launch the B-25 bombers approximately 400 miles from the Japanese coast, a distance carefully calculated to give the planes enough fuel to reach Tokyo, complete their bombing runs, and then continue to friendly airfields in China. But with the patrol boat forcing an early alert, the launch point was now 650 miles away from Japan, nearly one-third farther than any pilot had trained for. The risk was terrifying. The planes were already at maximum fuel capacity, stripped of extra weight wherever possible, and modified for long-range endurance. Every extra mile meant burning precious gallons of fuel and increasing the chance that the bombers would run out before reaching China. Yet, waiting any longer was equally dangerous. The patrol boat could call reinforcements, the carriers could be discovered by Japanese warships, and the mission could be compromised entirely. Doolittle made the call, launch immediately. There was no turning back. His calm demeanor masked the reality that he was sending men into nearly impossible odds. Crew members climbed into the cockpits of their modified B-25 Mitchell bombers, their hands trembling on the throttles but hearts steeled with courage. Each pilot knew that this launch could be their last moment alive, yet the determination in their eyes reflected a shared belief in the mission's necessity. As engines roared to life, the tension on the Hornet was palpable. Sailors cleared the deck with precision, and the first plane sped down the short runway. It lifted into the morning sky, wings catching the sunlight, carrying bombs, fuel, and an unyielding message of American resilience. One by one, the B-25s followed, their pilots adjusting for the carrier's pitch, calculating angles of liftoff, and pushing themselves to the very edge of possibility. Doolittle watched from the deck, his eyes scanning each takeoff. He had trained his men for this moment, but training could not erase the fear or the stakes. With each bomber that successfully lifted into the air, the impossible became reality. The early launch meant that many planes would run dangerously low on fuel before reaching China, but the symbolic impact of striking Japan, directly over Tokyo for the first time since Pearl Harbor, was worth every calculated risk. By the time the last plane took off, the Hornet's deck was empty, the air filled with the sound of fading engines, and the Pacific stretched endlessly before the raiders. What seemed like a mistake, the early launch, would ultimately become the defining moment that cemented the raid's daring legacy. The men had left the safety of the carrier behind, entering the unknown, carrying the hopes of a nation and the shock that would shake Japan to its core. The morning of April 18, 1942, was heavy with tension. On the deck of the USS Hornet, the modified B-25 bombers were lined up like a fleet of steel birds waiting to leap into an unforgiving sky. Sailors and officers moved with precision, checking every wheel, every bolt, every flap, and every fuel gauge. They knew that even the slightest miscalculation could turn the launch into a catastrophe. And yet, the impossible was about to happen, an Army bomber taking off from a Navy carrier, a feat no one had ever accomplished before. James Doolittle walked among the planes, offering calm words to his crews. His presence was a stabilizing force. He understood the stakes. Every pilot on that deck was facing danger that no training exercise could replicate. They were about to fly hundreds of miles over open ocean, strike Tokyo, and then attempt to reach safety in China, knowing that most would not have enough fuel to return home. Every man understood the mission's near-suicidal nature, but fear was replaced by determination. The first B-25 rolled forward, engines screaming, propellers cutting the salty air. Sailors held their breath, some gripping railings, others holding their hats to their chests, watching the massive bomber accelerate down the narrow deck. The aircraft gained speed, wheels bouncing slightly against the deck, and then, against all odds, it lifted off. The roar of its engines faded as it climbed into the morning sky. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Everyone on the Hornet realized they had just witnessed history. One by one, the bombers followed, each takeoff a delicate dance between precision and sheer nerve. Pilots had to compensate for the carrier's pitch, the wind over the deck, and the weight of extra fuel and bombs. A miscalculation of even a few feet could mean crashing into the ocean. But each plane soared successfully, wings glinting in the rising sun, engines singing the song of audacity and courage. The men on deck could finally breathe, though their relief was tempered by the knowledge that the hardest part of the mission was still ahead. Doolittle looked to the horizon, his mind already racing with calculations, fuel consumption, flight paths, weather conditions, and potential Japanese defenses. He knew that launching the planes was only the beginning. The raid's success would depend on navigation, precision, and sheer willpower. As the last bomber lifted into the air, a collective cheer erupted from the crew. They had witnessed the impossible. They had pushed the boundaries of aviation and military strategy. The B-25s were airborne, carrying the hopes of a nation and the first direct message of American retaliation to the heart of Japan. In Tokyo, no one yet knew what was coming. But in the skies above the Pacific, the impossible was real. American bombers were flying toward Japan, and the message was clear: America had begun to fight back, and it was only the beginning. Once the B-25 bombers cleared the USS Hornet's deck, the real challenge began, a perilous, 650-mile flight over the open Pacific Ocean toward the heart of Japan. What the men faced was more than a physical journey, it was a test of endurance, precision, and nerves stretched to their absolute limit. For most of the crews, this was their first mission of such scale, and they knew the slightest error could mean they would never reach land again. Every mile carried the weight of history, the expectations of a wounded nation, and the eyes of a world waiting to see whether America would strike back. The early morning sky was crisp and clear, offering perfect visibility, but also leaving them fully exposed. Doolittle's strategy relied on speed and altitude. Flying too high could make them visible to Japanese radar and anti-aircraft defenses. Flying too low risked exhaustion, miscalculation, or accidents over the ocean. The crews maintained a tense formation, the B-25s humming steadily as each pilot navigated using maps memorized during grueling training sessions. Every hour, every minute, brought them closer to Tokyo, and closer to danger. Fuel was the constant concern. The early launch meant the planes were burning reserves at maximum capacity. Doolittle had calculated meticulously, but the variables of wind, weight, and weather could quickly turn precision into disaster. Many crews were aware that, at best, they might not make it back to China. The mission was, in essence, one way. It was a psychological burden as much as a logistical one. Yet, there was no hesitation, no faltering resolve. Courage and determination propelled every pilot forward. The silence among the crews was punctuated only by the drone of engines and the occasional radio check. The men focused on keeping tight formation, calculating headings, and scanning the horizon for any sign of Japanese patrols or fighters. Every cloud, every glint on the water, was a potential threat. Doolittle himself constantly monitored the planes, issuing calm instructions to maintain morale and discipline. His experience and steadiness reassured the men, but the weight of responsibility was immense. As the flight progressed, fatigue began to set in. Hours of tense concentration, physical strain, and mental pressure wore down even the most disciplined crews. Some pilots recounted later that their hands ached from gripping controls, their eyes burned from constant vigilance, and their hearts pounded with the knowledge that each second could bring enemy fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Yet amidst the exhaustion, there was also exhilaration, a sense of participating in something unprecedented, historic, and transformative. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of water reflecting sunlight like shards of glass. Ahead lay Tokyo, a city confident in its security and completely unaware of the approaching American bombers. Every mile closer represented both a triumph of skill and the looming shadow of danger. For the Doolittle Raiders, the flight was more than a journey. It was a test of character, courage, and resolve. It was a message that America, though wounded, was rising to fight back. And as the coastline of Japan began to emerge on the horizon, the men knew the impossible was about to become reality. The first direct strike on the Japanese homeland. The sun had barely risen over Tokyo on April 18, 1942, when an unimaginable sound began to cut through the city's early morning calm, the distant roar of aircraft engines unlike any the Japanese had ever encountered. For decades, the island nation had prided itself on the security of its homeland, believing that thousands of miles of ocean, combined with vigilant air patrols and an invincible navy, made Tokyo untouchable. Yet now, without warning, American bombers appeared over the city, a full 8 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, delivering a shock that reverberated far beyond the physical damage they inflicted. The first bombers appeared as silhouettes against the early light, their B-25 Mitchell forms unfamiliar and menacing. Civilians watched in disbelief as the planes released their payloads. Explosions erupted from industrial sites, factories, and key military targets, sending columns of smoke into the sky. The blast was not massive in scale compared to the destruction Japan had inflicted across Asia, but its symbolic impact was devastating. Japan's leadership and population had been taught to believe their cities were inviolable. This raid shattered that illusion within minutes. Panic spread quickly. Families fled streets, unsure where the next bomb would fall. Air raid sirens blared, but many were unprepared for a strike coming from such an unexpected direction. Soldiers and local militia scrambled to respond, firing anti-aircraft guns at the sky with limited effect. Japanese pilots rushed to intercept, only to discover that the American bombers were fast, well-coordinated, and unlike anything they had trained to confront. In Tokyo's command centers, the reaction was immediate and severe. Officials demanded explanations. How had enemy planes penetrated so deeply without detection? Why had the Navy and air defenses failed? And most pressing, what did this mean for Japan's long-term security? For the first time since the war began, Japanese leaders faced the realization that the Americans had not only survived Pearl Harbor but were willing and able to strike back, even at the heart of the empire. The Doolittle Raid was not intended to cause massive destruction. Its purpose was psychological. And psychologically, it succeeded beyond measure. The raid demonstrated that Japan's homeland was vulnerable, its military could be bypassed, and its enemies were far from defeated. News of the bombings, once it spread, sent tremors through both military and civilian populations, raising fear and uncertainty. For the American pilots, the raid was only partially over. After releasing their bombs, they had to continue westward toward China, running perilously low on fuel. But even in that moment of danger, the pilots could take satisfaction in knowing that they had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. The message had been sent loud and clear. America was not only back in the fight, it had only just begun. Tokyo had awakened to a harsh new reality. The city that believed itself untouchable had been proven vulnerable, and Japanese leaders were forced to confront a terrifying truth. The Americans were determined, capable, and relentless. The Doolittle Raid had succeeded in its primary mission, to shock, to intimidate, and to ignite fear where none had existed before. The Doolittle Raid's impact on Japan was far more psychological than physical. While the bombers destroyed only a fraction of Tokyo's industrial targets and caused relatively limited casualties, the effect on Japanese morale and strategic thinking was seismic. The nation that had prided itself on invulnerability was suddenly faced with a harsh, inescapable truth. The American enemy had begun to strike back, and Japan was not untouchable. Within hours of the bombing, Japanese newspapers were filled with confusion and disbelief. Headlines scrambled to explain the unprecedented attack. Citizens had believed their cities were protected by thousands of miles of ocean and a vigilant military. The reality of bombers reaching Tokyo created panic and anger. Families scurried for shelters, factories shut down operations, and military personnel scrambled to reassess defense protocols. The idea that the homeland could be vulnerable, previously unthinkable, became an immediate, terrifying reality. The raid also sent shockwaves through Japan's military leadership. Commanders who had previously dismissed America's industrial capacity now recognized a new threat. The United States was capable of strategic strikes against the Japanese mainland. Confidence that the enemy was weak or hesitant evaporated overnight. High-ranking officers convened emergency meetings to evaluate the implications, knowing that if one small raid could reach Tokyo, more destructive missions were possible. For the Japanese Navy, the raid sparked particular concern. The Imperial fleet had been considered invincible, and the homeland was assumed to be safe behind a ring of carriers, patrols, and air defense systems. Yet the Doolittle Raid had bypassed these defenses effortlessly. It forced commanders to reconsider the security of even their most protected cities and highlighted vulnerabilities in fleet coordination and early warning systems. In many ways, the raid forced Japan to divert resources to homeland defense that could have been used elsewhere in the Pacific campaign. From a broader perspective, the raid's greatest success lay in its demonstration that America's military had recovered from Pearl Harbor and was capable of audacious operations. The psychological blow to Japan was amplified because it shattered the perception of American weakness. Before the raid, Tokyo's leaders believed the United States had been weakened, demoralized, and hesitant. After the bombing, it was clear that America had resolve, ingenuity, and the capacity to inflict damage even at extreme distances. Moreover, the Doolittle Raid inspired fear that far greater operations could follow. If the Americans could launch medium bombers from aircraft carriers, what would they attempt next? Japan realized that the enemy they had dismissed was far more dangerous than anticipated. This fear prompted strategic miscalculations in the months to come, ultimately contributing to Japan's vulnerability at battles such as Midway, where overconfidence and anxiety over American capabilities intersected disastrously. In short, the Doolittle Raid did not win a major battle in terms of destruction or occupation, but it altered the psychological landscape of the war. It reminded Japan that the United States was far from finished, forced the enemy to rethink strategy, and reignited American confidence. A symbolic attack had become a decisive blow to Japanese pride and overconfidence, proving that even a small, daring mission could reshape the course of history. While the Doolittle Raid inflicted only limited physical damage on Tokyo and other targets, its effect on American morale was profound and immediate. 8 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was still reeling from losses in the Pacific. Ships had been sunk, soldiers had been captured, and the scale of Japan's early victories had left the nation anxious and demoralized. The raid, however, delivered a dramatic and visible demonstration that America was not only recovering, it was capable of striking the heart of the Japanese Empire. News of the successful strike spread quickly across the United States. Headlines in newspapers declared that American bombers had attacked Tokyo, shocking readers and igniting a sense of national pride. Radio broadcasts replayed the story repeatedly, often accompanied by dramatic music and commentary emphasizing the bravery and ingenuity of the volunteers. Citizens, many of whom had felt helpless since December 1941, now had proof that the nation was fighting back. The psychological effect was immediate. Despair turned into hope, fear into confidence, and uncertainty into determination. In addition to boosting public morale, the raid had a galvanizing effect on the military itself. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen across the globe drew inspiration from the audacity of Doolittle and his crews. Training intensified, units became more focused, and a renewed sense of purpose spread throughout the ranks. Pilots who had previously doubted America's ability to project power began to envision larger missions, while planners started considering bolder operations that would stretch the Japanese military. The raid had, in essence, demonstrated that innovation and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the significance of this morale boost. Though he had not personally flown or participated in the mission, he knew that the raid would serve as a turning point in the American psychological war effort. In speeches and public statements, he praised the courage of the volunteers while emphasizing that the fight was far from over. The message was clear: America had suffered losses, but it was resilient, resourceful, and ready to strike wherever necessary. The Doolittle Raiders themselves became instant heroes. Their names and faces were celebrated in newspapers, magazines, and newsreels. Americans followed their daring journey with fascination, watching as the men risked everything to deliver a bold message to the enemy. The sense of national unity strengthened, as people realized that the same determination demonstrated by the raiders could, and would, be replicated across other branches of the military and throughout the war effort. Symbolically, the raid also reshaped the narrative of American capability. Previously, Japan had been seen as the unstoppable force in the Pacific, a notion that had contributed to fear and uncertainty.